The first thing I heard was the crunch of boots on gravel, slow, deliberate, like they wanted me to hear it before I saw them. Then came the voice, sharp and official, cutting through the quiet Texas morning. "Step away from the structure, sir. You're in violation of HOA code." I didn't move. The smell of hot asphalt drifted from the road they'd just paved last week without permission, mixing with the faint scent of motor oil still clinging to my hands from the workbench. I stood there on my own property, looking at 3 uniformed HOA officers standing just inside my fence line like they owned the place. Their radios crackled. One of them adjusted his belt, eyes scanning my land like it was already theirs. And right behind them, stepping out of a spotless white SUV like she was arriving at a ribbon-cutting ceremony, was Diane Whitmore. Perfect hair, perfect smile, the kind that never reached her eyes. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, voice smooth as polished glass, "we've tried to handle this amicably." I could taste the dust in the air as a light breeze rolled across the yard, carrying the faint metallic tang of fresh-cut fence posts. "Mine snapped clean 2 nights ago. You've ignored multiple notices," she continued, holding up a clipboard like it was a badge of authority. "This property is now subject to enforcement action." I let my gaze drift past her, over the line where my grass met the road, where the survey stakes used to be before someone decided they were inconvenient. Every detail burned into my memory. Every inch of ground. Every sound. "You're trespassing," I said quietly. One of the officers stepped forward, boots grinding into the gravel. "Sir, you need to comply." Comply. The word hung in the air like humidity before a storm. I could feel the weight of it pressing down, not just from them, but from weeks of letters, fines, and quiet threats that had escalated one step at a time. Diane tilted her head, that same practiced smile never fading. "We're authorized to be here." Authorized? I almost laughed. Instead, I exhaled slowly, letting the moment stretch just long enough. Long enough for them to get comfortable. Long enough for them to believe they were in control. The officer closest to me reached toward my arm, not aggressively, just enough to guide, to assert presence, to make it clear they thought this was already over. That's when I noticed the small details most people would miss. The angle of their entry past the property line, the time stamped on the radio dispatch, the fact that none of them had actual municipal insignia, just HOA-issued patches stitched a little too clean. Diane stepped closer, lowering her voice like she was doing me a favor. "You should have just followed the rules." I looked at her, really looked this time, at the confidence, the certainty, the quiet assumption that people like me eventually fold. The wind picked up again, rustling through the broken fence behind me, carrying that same dry, dusty smell. I let a small smile slip, just enough to confuse her. Because the truth was, I hadn't ignored anything. I had watched. I had recorded. I had waited. And standing there, surrounded by people who thought they were enforcing rules, I realized something almost funny. They weren't stopping me. They were building my case for me. And they had just stepped exactly where I needed them to. A week earlier, the neighborhood sounded different, quieter in a way that made every small noise stand out, like the low hum of my security cameras cycling through their night check or the distant hiss of sprinklers turning on in perfect suburban rhythm. I remember standing at the edge of my driveway just after sunrise, coffee cooling in my hand, watching a utility truck idle at the corner where my property met the subdivision road. The engine vibrated through the ground, a steady mechanical pulse that did not belong there. The logo on the door was half covered in dust, but I could still make out the HOA initials printed in bold, like they were trying to pass themselves off as something official. That was the first time I felt it, that quiet shift from annoyance to something more calculated. I set the cup down on the tailgate of my truck and walked closer, boots crunching over gravel that had been there long before anyone decided to build matching mailboxes and enforce grass height with rulers. The driver avoided eye contact, pretending to check paperwork that did not exist. I did not say anything. I just looked at the ground where a fresh orange marker had been driven in overnight, right on the edge of my land, about 3 inches past where it should have been. 3 inches might not sound like much, but in property law, it is the difference between ownership and theft. The air smelled faintly of cut wood and something synthetic, like new plastic or survey tape, and I knew right then this was not a mistake. Later that afternoon, the letter arrived, thick paper, crisp edges, the kind that tries too hard to look official. I could hear the envelope slide across the floor when it came through the mail slot, a soft scrape that felt louder than it should have. I opened it at the kitchen counter, the scent of fresh ink still strong, and read through language that danced around authority without ever actually having it. Violations, noncompliance, community enforcement, words designed to intimidate, not to hold up in court. I folded it carefully and placed it beside a stack of documents I had already started building. Because by then, I was not reacting anymore. I was observing. Over the next few days, the pattern became clear. More markers appeared, each one just slightly off. A crew showed up early one morning and measured the roadside, their tape stretching across my boundary like they were testing how far they could push before someone pushed back. I let them. Every movement, every placement, every step over the line was recorded, time-stamped, and stored. The cameras picked up everything, from the way they hesitated before crossing onto my property to the quiet conversations they thought no one could hear. And then there was Diane. She started showing up more often, always in that same white SUV, always stepping out like she was inspecting something she already owned. One afternoon, she stood at the edge of my fence, heels pressing into the dirt, and told me this was about maintaining standards. Her voice carried that same polished tone, but underneath it was impatience, like she was waiting for me to break, to argue, to give her something she could use. I did. Not give her anything. I nodded, listened, and let the silence stretch just long enough to make her uncomfortable. Because the truth was, I had already seen enough. The way the markers shifted, the way the letters escalated, the way they kept stepping just a little further each time. They thought they were building pressure. What they were really doing was creating a record, piece by piece, step by step, until the line they crossed was no longer small, no longer arguable, but clear, undeniable, and permanent. By the third day, the air around my property felt different, heavier, like something was building just beneath the surface. I woke up before sunrise, the sky still a dull gray, and stepped outside with a thermos of coffee in my hand. The ground was cool under my boots, damp from the overnight humidity, and the only sound was the distant buzz of a transformer somewhere down the road. Then I heard it again, that low mechanical rumble, not loud, but steady enough to cut through the quiet. Another truck, different this time, parked just outside my boundary line. I took a slow sip, letting the bitterness settle, and watched as two men stepped out, carrying measuring equipment and a clipboard that looked far too official for what they were doing. They moved with that same rehearsed confidence, like they had done this before, like no one had ever stopped them. One of them glanced toward my house, hesitated for half a second, then kept going. That hesitation told me everything I needed to know. They were not sure where the line was anymore, or maybe they knew exactly where it was and were choosing to ignore it. Either way, they crossed it. One step, then another, boots pressing into soil that had been in my family longer than any of those houses down the street. I did not say a word. I let them work, stretching their tape across my land, marking points that did not belong to them, writing notes that would never hold up under real scrutiny. The cameras picked it all up, every angle, every timestamp, every quiet conversation they thought was lost in the open air. I could hear fragments carried on the breeze, words like adjustment, expansion, compliance. Not once. Did they say permission? That word never came up. Later that afternoon, Diane returned, stepping out of her SUV with that same controlled energy, like she was managing a project instead of interfering with someone else's property. She walked the line slowly, heels clicking against small stones, eyes scanning the markers as if she had placed them herself. When she reached me, she did not ask questions. She made statements. This area is under review. These changes are necessary. The community expects cooperation. I listened, nodding just enough to keep her talking. The more she said, the more she revealed, not in content, but in tone. She believed this was already decided. She believed I had already lost. That kind of confidence does not come from guessing. It comes from thinking you are protected. I leaned against the truck, feeling the heat from the metal under my palm, and asked one simple question. Where is the authorization? She paused, just for a second, then smiled again, that same practiced expression. It is all documented. Of course it was. Somewhere, in some file, probably signed by someone who never stepped foot on this land. I did not push further. I did not argue. I just let the silence hang there until she filled it with more assumptions, more statements, more overreach. Because every word she spoke, every instruction she gave, every step her crew took past that invisible boundary was turning something small into something much bigger. They thought they were expanding control. What they were really doing was stacking evidence, layer by layer, until the picture was no longer something they could reshape. And standing there, with the early evening sun casting long shadows across my yard, I realized they were getting close to the point where there would be no turning back, not for them, not for anyone involved. The next morning, the pattern shifted from quiet intrusion to something far more deliberate. I heard it before I saw it, the steady beeping of a reversing vehicle echoing down the road, sharp and mechanical against the stillness of early daylight. When I stepped outside, the air carried the thick smell of diesel and fresh paint, the kind that lingers in the back of your throat. Parked just beyond my boundary line was a flatbed truck loaded with metal signage, bright reflective surfaces catching the first rays of sunlight. Community access route. Authorized entry only. The words were printed in bold, clean letters, like they had already decided the outcome before anyone asked a question. I walked closer, slow and measured, boots pressing into the same ground that had been marked and remarked all week. The driver avoided my eyes, just like the others, but his hands moved quickly, almost nervously, as he checked straps and glanced toward the subdivision entrance. That was when I noticed the placement. Not on their side, not even near the disputed line. Right inside my property, about 6 feet in, positioned like it had always belonged there. I stopped just short of it, close enough to read every letter clearly, and let the moment settle. 6 feet is not an accident. 6 feet is intent. I turned slightly, just enough for the nearest camera to catch the full angle, the marker, the sign, the truck, all in one frame. Every detail aligned. Every piece of the puzzle falling into place without me having to touch it. By mid-morning, Diane arrived again, her SUV rolling in smooth and controlled, tires barely making a sound on the newly paved surface. She stepped out with a folder this time, thicker than before, the edges crisp, like it had been prepared for presentation rather than discussion. "We are formalizing access," she said, not even bothering with greetings. Her voice carried that same rehearsed authority, but there was something sharper underneath it now, a sense of urgency. I nodded slightly, letting her continue. "This section of land is critical for community flow," she added, gesturing toward the sign like it proved her point. I followed her gesture, then looked back at her, keeping my expression neutral. "On what basis?" I asked quietly. She opened the folder, flipping through pages filled with maps, lines drawn in neat ink, boundaries adjusted just enough to favor her argument. "Revised community planning documentation," she said, tapping the page with a manicured finger. "Approved at the board level. Board level. Not county. Not state. Not anything that actually held weight beyond their own circle." I let my gaze drift over the document, noting the missing seals, the absence of official stamps, the subtle inconsistencies in scale that most people would never catch. But I did. I always did. "You are placing permanent structures on private property," I said, calm and even. One of the men from the truck shifted his weight behind her, the gravel crunching louder than it should have. Diane did not look back. "Temporary enforcement measures," she corrected, her smile tightening just enough to reveal the edge beneath it. Temporary. Another word designed to soften something that was anything but. I stepped back, just a single pace, creating space not for them, but for the frame, for the documentation, for the story that was writing itself in real time. Because what they did next mattered more than anything that had come before. The driver lifted one of the signs, carried it past the marker, and began positioning it deeper into my land, aligning it as if following instructions that had already been given. Diane watched, silent now, confident, certain. And that was the moment it became irreversible. They were no longer testing boundaries. They were establishing control. And in doing that, they crossed from assumption into action, from suggestion into enforcement, from something arguable into something undeniable. I did not stop them. I did not raise my voice. I simply stood there, letting the cameras capture every second, knowing that by the time they realized what they had actually done, it would already be too late to take it back. By that afternoon, the heat had settled in thick and heavy, pressing down on everything like a weight you could feel in your chest. The metal sign they had planted caught the sunlight and threw it back in sharp flashes, each reflection like a signal that something was off, something that did not belong. I stood on the porch for a moment, listening. No wind, no birds, just the faint ticking of cooling engines and the distant hum of suburban life carrying on like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. I walked back toward the boundary, each step deliberate, my eyes tracing the path they had taken earlier. The sign was set deeper now, not just placed but anchored, the base pressed firmly into soil that had never been theirs to touch. I crouched slightly, not to inspect it, but to let the camera catch the angle, the depth, the exact position relative to the original markers that still sat just a few feet away. Those markers, now slightly off alignment, told a story all on their own. A shift here, an adjustment there. Small moves designed to look harmless until they added up to something permanent. I straightened up just as another vehicle approached, slower this time, tires rolling over gravel with a soft crunch that echoed in the quiet. It was not a work truck. It was one of their patrol units, the kind they liked to use to create presence. Two of the same officers stepped out, the ones from earlier, their posture more confident now, like they believed the ground beneath them had already been claimed. One of them held a clipboard, the other kept scanning the property like he was memorizing it. They walked straight past the sign, past the marker, and onto my land without hesitation. No pause this time. No second guessing. Just assumption. "We are here to ensure compliance," the one with the clipboard said, his voice steady but rehearsed. I could hear the faint static from his radio, the kind that fills silence when there is nothing real to say. I nodded once, slow, measured, letting the moment stretch. "You have already insured something," I replied quietly. He frowned slightly, not understanding, and glanced down at his notes as if the answer might be written there. The second officer shifted his stance, boots pressing deeper into the dirt, leaving clear impressions that would not disappear quickly. Every detail mattered. Every step counted. Behind them, Diane's SUV rolled back into view, stopping just short of the sign like it marked a boundary she respected only when it suited her. She stepped out, sunglasses on now, reflecting the scene back at me in mirrored glass. "We are moving forward," she said. No introduction, no explanation, just a statement of intent. The officer with the clipboard began reading off violations, each one sounding more official than the last, but none of them grounded in anything real. Temporary structures, unauthorized resistance, failure to comply with community standards. The words stacked up, one after another, like they were building a wall out of language alone. I listened to every word, committing each one to memory, knowing the audio was already captured, time-stamped, and stored. When he finished, there was a brief silence, the kind that usually expects a response. I did not give one. Instead, I took a single step back, giving them more space, inviting them deeper without saying it out loud. The second officer moved instinctively, following that space, crossing further in without hesitation. Diane watched, arms crossed now, confident, composed, completely certain that this was the final stage, that control had already shifted. But what she did not see, what none of them saw, was how clean the line had become. No more gray areas. No more small adjustments. Just a clear, documented sequence of actions that could not be explained away. And as the late afternoon sun stretched their shadows across my land, I realized they had finally reached the point I had been waiting for, the moment where everything they did from here on out would not just be recorded, it would be undeniable. That evening, the temperature dropped just enough to carry sound further than usual, and every small noise seemed sharper, clearer, like the world had turned the volume up on purpose. I stood near the edge of the property again, the metal sign still catching the last traces of sunlight, now casting a long shadow that stretched deeper into my land than it had any right to be. The air smelled faintly of dry grass and warm metal, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once before everything went quiet again. I checked my watch, noting the time, then glanced toward the cameras mounted along the fence line, each one angled perfectly, each one recording without interruption. The sequence was complete now. Entry, marking, placement, enforcement. There were no gaps left, no missing pieces, just a clean, uninterrupted chain of actions. That told the whole story without needing explanation. I heard the low crackle of a radio before I saw them again. The same two officers stepping back onto the property, their movements slower this time, more deliberate, like they were settling into a routine they believed was already established. One of them adjusted his sleeve, the fabric brushing against the microphone clipped near his collar, sending a brief burst of static into the air. "Final notice," he said, his voice carrying across the yard, steady but slightly tighter than before. The clipboard in his hand looked heavier now, not because of what was written on it, but because of what it represented. They thought this was the last step before compliance. I let him speak, listing off terms and conditions that had no real foundation, his words blending into the quiet hum of the evening. When he finished, there was that same pause, the expectation hanging there again, waiting for me to respond, to argue, to push back. I did not. Instead, I took a slow breath, letting the cool air fill my lungs, and stepped to the side, clearing a path without saying a word. It was a small movement, almost insignificant, but it changed everything. The second officer hesitated for a fraction of a second, then followed the opening, stepping further in, boots pressing down into soil that had already recorded too many unauthorized steps. Diane arrived moments later, her vehicle rolling in with that same controlled precision, headlights cutting briefly across the yard before shutting off. She stepped out, arms folded, posture relaxed, like she was watching a process unfold exactly as planned. "This can still be resolved," she said, her tone softer now, almost persuasive, but the edge was still there, hidden just beneath the surface. I looked at her, then at the officers, then back at the sign planted firmly behind them. "It already is," I replied. She frowned slightly, the first real crack in her composure, but she masked it quickly, shifting her weight as if dismissing the comment. The officer with the clipboard made another note, pen scratching against paper, the sound sharp in the still air. Every second stretched, every movement captured, every word preserved. The wind picked up just enough to rustle the edges of the documents in his hand, and I could see the corner of one page lift, revealing a blank section where authorization should have been. That small detail mattered more than anything he had said out loud. I let my gaze linger there for just a moment, then stepped back again, giving them even more room, more confidence, more opportunity to continue. Because at this point, I was not waiting for them to stop. I was waiting for them to finish. And as the last light faded behind the line of houses, casting everything into a dim, even glow, I knew they were about to cross the final threshold, the one that would turn everything they had done into something they could not explain away, not with words, not with documents, not with anything they thought they controlled. The moment came quieter than I expected, not with shouting or sudden movement, but with a single, simple action that sealed everything. The officer with the clipboard took 2 more steps forward, crossing past the sign, past the markers, and stopping just a few feet from my porch. Close enough that I could hear the faint creak of his boots as he shifted his weight. Close enough that the small body camera clipped to his chest caught a full, unobstructed view of my property behind him. The other officer followed without hesitation, mirroring the position, forming a line that suggested control, authority, presence. Diane stayed just behind them, arms still folded, her posture relaxed but her eyes sharp, watching for a reaction that never came. The air had cooled further now, carrying the faint scent of evening dew settling over the grass, mixing with the lingering smell of warm metal from the sign they had planted earlier. It was quiet enough that I could hear the soft ticking of my porch light switching on automatically as the daylight faded. That small click felt louder than anything they had said. "This is your final opportunity to comply," the officer said, his voice steady. But there was something underneath it now, something less certain, like he was reading lines that no longer felt solid. I let the silence stretch again, just long enough for the weight of that statement to settle into the ground between us. Then I reached into my pocket, slow, deliberate, every movement visible, every angle clear for the cameras that had been recording since the first marker was placed. The fabric of my jacket brushed softly against my wrist as I pulled out a thin, worn leather holder, the edges smooth from years of use. I did not open it immediately. I just held it there for a second, letting their eyes lock onto it, letting curiosity replace confidence. Diane's expression shifted first, just a fraction, her head tilting slightly, as if recalculating something she had already decided. The officer closest to me frowned, his grip on the clipboard tightening just enough to wrinkle the paper beneath his fingers. Then I opened it. Not fast, not dramatic, just enough to reveal the badge inside, the metal catching the porch light and reflecting it back in a clean, steady glow. Federal Compliance Division. The words sat there without explanation, without emphasis, but they did not need any. The air changed immediately, not in sound, but in weight. The kind of shift you feel before anyone speaks, when everything realigns in a single second. You have been operating under assumed authority, I said calmly, my voice even, controlled, carrying just far enough to reach all three of them without raising it. On federally monitored property. The officer with the clipboard blinked once, then again, his eyes moving from the badge to the sign behind him, then back to me. Diane did not move at all. That was the interesting part. She stayed perfectly still, like if she held her position long enough, the situation might correct itself. Every entry, every placement, every enforcement action has been recorded. I continued, letting each word land clean, without rush, without pressure, with timestamps, location data, and audio verification. The second officer shifted back slightly, just enough to break the line they had formed earlier, his boots scraping against the dirt in a way that sounded much louder now than before. Diane finally uncrossed her arms, but she did not step forward. She did not speak. She just looked at the badge again, then at the cameras she had ignored all week, and for the first time, her confidence did not return. Because what she was seeing now was not resistance. It was structure. It was documentation. It was something far bigger than a disagreement over property lines. And standing there, with the quiet settling in around us and the evidence already locked in place, I knew they had finally reached the point where this was no longer about what they wanted to enforce, but about what they were going to have to answer for. For a few seconds, nobody said anything, and that silence carried more weight than any argument they had tried to make all week. The porch light hummed faintly above us, casting a steady glow across the badge still open in my hand, reflecting just enough to keep their eyes locked on it. The officer with the clipboard cleared his throat, a small, involuntary sound that broke the stillness. His eyes dropped to the paper again, scanning lines that no longer meant what he thought they did. We were informed this was under HOA jurisdiction, he said, slower now, like each word had to be chosen carefully. I did not move. You were informed incorrectly, I replied, keeping my tone even, letting the facts sit without pressure. Behind him, the second officer shifted his stance again, this time stepping back half a pace, creating distance where moments ago there had been none. The crunch of gravel under his boot sounded sharper now, almost out of place. Diane finally took a step forward, heels pressing into the dirt, her posture still controlled but no longer relaxed. There must be some misunderstanding, she said, her voice smooth, but the edge was different now, less certain, more cautious. I closed the badge slowly, the soft click of the leather folding shut echoing in the quiet. There is no misunderstanding, I said. This property has been under federal monitoring for boundary compliance and unauthorized enforcement activity. The words were simple, but they carried weight, the kind that does not need explanation to be understood. Diane's eyes flicked toward the sign behind her, then toward the cameras she had ignored before, and for the first time, she really looked at them. Not as decorations, not as something to dismiss, but as records, permanent ones. The officer with the clipboard lowered it slightly, his grip loosening as the paper shifted in his hands. We were acting on directives, he added, almost as if that would place distance between him and the situation. I nodded once. And those directives are now part of the record. The air felt cooler now, or maybe it was just the tension shifting, settling into something more controlled, more defined. No one stepped forward again. No one crossed another inch. Diane inhaled slowly, her shoulders rising just slightly before she straightened, trying to reclaim the composure that had slipped. We can review the documentation, she said, carefully, as if choosing a safer path. I glanced toward the sign, the markers, the footprints pressed into the soil, each one captured, each one time-stamped. You already have, I replied. The second officer looked toward the road, then back at me, like he was measuring distance now instead of authority. The first officer closed his clipboard, the sound of it snapping shut quiet but final. Diane turned her head slightly, looking at both of them, And in that brief exchange without words, something shifted. Not power, not control, just realization. Because what stood in front of them was not resistance they could push through or negotiate around. It was structure, documentation, and jurisdiction they could not override. The wind moved lightly across the yard, brushing against the metal sign and producing a faint, hollow sound, like something settling into place. And as they stood there, no longer advancing, no longer speaking with the same certainty, it became clear that everything they had built over the past week had just reversed direction. Not with force, not with argument, but with something far more precise. The kind of shift that happens when the truth is already recorded and there is nothing left to rewrite. The next morning, the neighborhood sounded different again, but this time it was not quiet. It was controlled, measured, like every movement had purpose. I stood at the same spot near the edge of my property, the early sunlight stretching across the ground, catching the metal sign that now looked less like authority and more like evidence left behind. The air carried the faint scent of fresh coffee from somewhere down the street, mixed with the clean, sharp smell of morning dew settling into the grass. Then I heard it, not the rumble of HOA trucks, not the soft crunch of unauthorized steps, but something else entirely. Tires rolling slow and steady, engines tuned low, deliberate. Two dark vehicles approached, unmarked but unmistakable in the way they moved, precise, controlled, stopping just short of the boundary line that had been ignored all week. Doors opened almost in sync, quiet but firm, and the people who stepped out did not hesitate, did not look around for approval, did not check clipboards. They already knew where they stood. The officers from the night before were still there, their posture different now, no longer forming lines, no longer projecting control. Diane stood near the sign, her arms no longer crossed, her stance less certain, like the ground beneath her had shifted in ways she could not see but could definitely feel. One of the men from the new arrivals stepped forward, his shoes pressing lightly into the gravel, stopping exactly at the property line, not an inch over. That detail mattered. It always did. He glanced once at me, a brief acknowledgement, then turned his attention to the scene in front of him. "We will need everyone to step back beyond the marked boundary," he said calmly, his voice steady without needing to be raised. No hesitation, no argument. The two HOA officers moved first, almost instinctively, stepping back past the sign they had helped place, their boots leaving the same impressions they had made the day before, only now in reverse. Diane hesitated for half a second longer, her eyes moving from the sign to the vehicles, to the cameras she now could not ignore, and finally back to me. For the first time, there was no polished smile, no controlled expression, just calculation that had run out of options. She stepped back. The man nodded slightly, then looked toward the sign, the markers, the disturbed ground that told the entire story without needing a single word. "This area is under review for unauthorized enforcement actions," he continued, each word clean, precise, final. The wind moved lightly again, brushing against the sign and producing that same hollow sound, but this time it felt different, like something closing instead of opening. I stayed where I was, not moving forward, not needing to. Everything that needed to happen was already in motion. The documentation, the recordings, the sequence of actions, all of it had led to this exact point. Diane looked once more at the sign, then at the officers who had stepped back, and finally at the ground where the markers no longer aligned with anything she could defend. No one spoke for a moment. Then one of the new arrivals began taking notes. Not hurried, not reactive, just methodical, as if confirming what had already been established. The morning light grew stronger, washing over the property, over the sign, over the footprints that marked every step taken too far. And as I stood there, watching it all settle into place, I realized something simple. They thought control came from showing up, from speaking louder, from pushing further. But control does not work like that. Control is quiet. It is patient. It waits. And when the moment comes, it does not need to argue. It just needs to show the truth exactly as it happened. And by the time they understood that, everything they had built was already gone, not taken, not forced, just undone by the very steps they chose to take.